This is the Faith Debate, a theological roundtable gabfest, a free-for-all forum with faith community leaders wrestling over the truth.
Hoorah.
In less than 1/2 hour, learn more about what really matters than what most others learn in a week.
Hoorah.
The Faith Debate is on the World Wide Web at WFMD.com, keyword faith. Are you ready for the clash of ideas? Are you ready for the sound of freedom? Let's get ready to rumble in this corner, weighing in with the Master of Divinity from Reformed Theological Seminary, the Faith Debate Master of Ceremonies.
Oh, yeah.
Troy Skinner.
Welcome to another edition of the Faith Debate. Thank you so much for tuning in again this week. We're on every week, Sunday mornings, 9 to 9:30 here on News Radio 930 WFMD. We're going to take the next 3 weeks and we're going to look at end times views, post-millennialism, pre-millennialism, amillennialism, and the different variations within those views. We can't cover everything, but we're going to cover about as much as we possibly can, as quickly as we can. And so without any further ado, let's jump right on in.
Good things come to those who wait. And speaking about good things to come to those who wait, the topic today is what Christians believe about the end times. So we're kind of doing a informal series, if you will. People who are participating in the Facebook Live are suggesting questions that they're interested about, they've always wondered about, they're not sure about, don't know what to think about, kind of things. And so this week it's the topic about the end times, the last days, Armageddon, all that sort of stuff. Next week is going to be, are there such things as ghosts? That was suggested last week, and we'll do it next week. So there is a ton of ground to cover, which is why I said we're not going to have time to do a song. We're probably going to end up covering the kind of material that if this were a Sunday school class, a group study, a seminary or college class, it'd be an entire semester. So we're going to do an entire semester in less than, 50 minutes is the goal here. So, and why this is we're not going to talk about things that non-Christians think about the end of the world. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about there. And we're not going to talk about things that would clearly be labeled as heretical by the church. And there might be some people that are within the church who would hold heretical views. We're going to be focusing on views that there's a divergence of opinion and view, but none of them will be considered heretical. None of them are salvation issues. And there's a divergence because the Bible is really clear in some particular and important ways, and there are some other areas where the Bible is not quite as clear, and it's harder for us to know. The edges are fuzzy, and we fill in those edges with our own ideas sometimes. Before it's all said and done, I will tell you kind of what my position is, just so you know. It doesn't mean I'm the be-all, end-all, and have it all figured out. I would say I do, but if you disagree, that's fine. So here's the framework, and you're not really going to need a Bible because I'm not going to be referencing a whole bunch of Bible verses. There will be a few, but if you want to take notes, you can take mental notes. If you want to jot some things down, it might be helpful later. So we're going to have a three-part structure. The first part and last part will be relatively short compared to the middle part. The middle part is very complex and complicated, a lot of stuff going on, and that's going to be the heart of what we have to talk about. There are three primary views of the last days, of the end of time as we know it, among Christians. Those three views are labeled postmillennialism, premillennialism, and amillennialism. So millennialism, millennial, it's a Latin word. Mille is the Latin word for 1,000. So millennial is a period of time that's 1,000 something, 1,000 years. It's a reference to what's going on, what's talked about in the book of Revelation. And so the post, the pre, and the have some are in relationship to Christ's return, his second coming, the second advent, whatever label you want to put on that. So if a Christian believes that there will be a 1,000-year millennium and then Christ returns, that would be the post-millennial view because his return comes post-millennium. Premillennium comes before the start of the 1,000 years, and the amillennial, we'll get into that. It's a little bit more symbolic, and it's not about an exact timing question. So postmillennialism. Postmillennialism. in this view of the end times, people who hold this view, they see Christ's second coming as happening after the 1,000-year reign. This 1,000-year period represents a golden age in world history. Most people with this view, they expect that they're a very optimistic view of how time is going to progress and march forward. So they expect the vast majority of people, increasing number of people over time, to be saved, to become Christians, to be obedient in their Christian walk, that there will be an increasing gospel momentum and expansion of the kingdom that will produce a protracted time of just wonderfulness, of faith and righteousness and peace and prosperity. Things are getting better all the time. Very, very optimistic view. And then at the end of this golden age, Christ returns. Now, some postmillennialists, their view is that the Bible says a millennium, 1,000 years, and it's going to be 1,000 years. Exactly. Others would see the 1,000 years a little bit more figurative, representing a very long period of time. Could be hundreds of years, could be several thousand years. Where, they don't necessarily hang their hat on a particular length of time. This actually has a lot in common with a portion of what the amillennialist position is, by the way. At the conclusion of the millennium, Christ returns. This ends history. And at that point would be the general resurrection and the final judgment. And after that would be the eternal order, the ongoing reality, whatever that's going to be after that. Now, you might not have heard much about this because it's not really that in vogue these days in most Christian circles, but this view was the dominant theological view among Protestants, especially, in the United States. And those Protestants who pushed for reformed movements in American history, we're going to have temperance movements, and we're going to do things to help people not sin and make things better and better. And this was particularly true if you're a student of American history. With the Second Great Awakening, was pretty much fueled by an awful lot of post-millennial thinkers and believers. But as you might imagine, a view this optimistic, all the way through in the 1800s, the Second Great Awakening. But then World War I happened, all the violence of the 1920s happened, the Great Depression of the 30s happened, World War II in the 40s happened, and the Cold War and the dawn of the atomic age, and lots of unrest and civil strife, and so it didn't fit very well with an optimistic view of how things were getting better and better all the time, and so this particular view began to recede in popularity among Christians and among theologians. Because people became more pessimistic and more disillusioned, which doesn't square real well with this particular view. Now, but despite all that, there are still some major pockets among Christianity who hold this view, particularly among those who are currently preaching abolitionism and the social gospel and what is called the Christian Reconstructionism. And you could actually argue that in some ways this particular view, postmillennialism, is making a bit of a comeback, despite critics who push back against this, saying they have what theologians like to call an over-realized eschatology. An over-realized eschatology of the last things, last days, and over-realized meaning we think that the last days are already here. They're pulling the promises of the future too much into the present, and they have too much optimism, and that's a pretty consistent refrain of critique against them. But in spite of this, they're gaining some steam. Something that's that most non-postmillennials expect is a period of apostasy, of falling away, where the church itself, or the visible church, the church that we see, not the church that God necessarily sees, the church that we see, becomes less faithful to the Word. Postmillennialists, because they're so optimistic they're getting better and better, they think the church is going to become more obedient and isn't going to wrestle with the apostasy in the same way. So recapping, postmillennialism holds to the belief that gradually the gospel is going to convert the majority of the world's inhabitants. Christians, as a result of this, are going to possess increasing political power. In fact, they will rule all of the nations. They will control all aspects of life in each of the nations. There will be a genuinely Christian culture that takes root and flourishes, thus Christianizing the entire world. The human race as a whole, they would hold that there's exceptions, but on the whole, the human race will be obedient to the law of God. And so therefore, there will be earthly peace worldwide. Right? There will be unprecedented material prosperity. Right? Poverty will disappear. Crime, basically non-existent. This is what they're thinking is going to be coming before then Christ returns. Now, proponents of this particular view, the postmillennial view, would include the Puritans, who were important, obviously, in the founding of this nation. Famous people like Jonathan Edwards, Charles Hodge, James Henry Thornwell, A.A. Hodge, B.D. Warfield, and lots of other famous names. So even though you might not have heard a whole lot about it, it is a minority view in the Christian world right now. There are some heavyweight theologians that would fit in this camp, so it's not an insignificant view. And like I said, none of what we're talking about today would be considered heresy, although I do think there are more problems with some of the views than some of the others. All right. Now you got to buckle up. I'm going to do my best to simplify this, and if anybody watching this video is a premillennialist, I'm going to cover this so quickly that you might feel I'm covering parts of it unfairly. I'm not meaning to be unfair. But there's a lot of ground to cover in premillennialism because there are so many camps within or under the umbrella of premillennialism. There are two primary camps. So you have premillennialism on the whole, and then over here you've got historic premillennialism, and over here, a much larger group, you have what's called dispensational premillennialism. Historic premillennialism is called historic because opponents of this view, they would claim that this view goes all the way back to the early church fathers, that it is the historic view of the church. Now, postmillennialists and amillennialists would argue that point, but they're trying to make themselves distinct from a Johnny-come-lately on the theological stage with dispensational premillennialism, say, no, that's new. We're not that. We're something that goes back 2,000 years. By the way, in case you hear terms at some point, or you've heard terms before and you're wondering where they fit, the historic premillennialism is sometimes also referred to as post-tribulational premillennialism, just putting that out there. So, again, this view teaches the second coming of Christ, his second advent, is going to occur before his 1,000-year reign happens, because it's pre-millennial. Christ comes, and then the millennium comes. And then after the millennium comes a great apostasy that we were talking about a moment ago. And during this great apostasy, this could include a time of great tribulation. Different people within the historic premillennial view differ a little bit on that. Now, a major difference between historic and dispensational premillennialism has to do with the church in relation to Israel. The historic view that we're focusing on right now does not make a very sharp distinction at all between Israel and the church. Instead, viewing believers, those who are God's people, his elect, from all ages as part of one group. They hold this in common with an awful lot of millennialists, by the way. And this plays out importantly. That's why the historic premillennialists don't want to be thought of as dispensational premillennialists, because a variety of reasons, but this is a big one. Historic premillennialists see no issue at all with the church going through a great tribulation, and this therefore eliminates the need for a separate pre-tribulational rapture of believers. We'll talk more about what the rapture is in a moment, but historic premillennialists, they don't emphasize the rapture. Some of them would probably discount that there is a rapture. So that's a pretty big difference between them and the dispensationalists. Proponents of historic premillennialism would include, just like the other group I just mentioned, some pretty heavyweight theologians like Charles Spurgeon, Al Mohler, John Piper, Francis Schaeffer, D.A. Carson, some very famous, well-regarded heavyweight theologians, and a whole bunch of other famous names in this camp. So now, dispensational premillennialism. This is where it's really, really thick with weeds. This is really the hardest part for you to track with, and I'll do my best to simplify it. Dispensational premillennialism has a number of main branches, all under. So we have the big picture of premillennialism, historic premillennialism over here, and then dispensational premillennialism over here. And under the dispensational part, there's a whole bunch of other smaller umbrellas, which would include classical dispensationalists, progressive dispensationalists, traditional dispensationalists, grace movement dispensationalists, and others. So, dispensationalism interprets the Bible through a system, a grid, if you will, a historic grid that divides history into what they label and identify as dispensations. These dispensations are periods or ages of, periods of time within which God deals distinctly and differently with people, and particularly with his people in those moments. So you have this dispensation followed by this dispensation followed by this dispensation, and in each of those dispensations, God is acting and moving and dealing with his people very differently. And so there is a lot of discontinuity in the way that God deals with people over time. And so, hence, there is a definite distinction, therefore, between Israel and the Christian church. Israel, in the dispensational mindset, is an ethnic nation. And the promises to that ethnic nation, to those people of God, need to be fulfilled to the ethnic people of God. And they would say that the church, in distinction from this, would be all the saved individuals who are part of our present age, our present dispensation, which generally most dispensationalists would probably say somewhere around Pentecost, or the time of Jesus on earth, very often from Pentecost all the way up to at least the rapture, maybe through the end of the 7-year tribulation, according to their system. So again, I mentioned there's classical dispensationalists. They see the present day church, the age that we're in now, the church that we have now. They see this time as a parenthesis in the progress of ethnic Israel. So again, all these dispensations of dealing with ethnic Israel, and then there's a pause. God hits the pause button, and there's a parenthesis for the church. And then at the end of this parentheses time, God unpauses and picks back up with his promises to ethnic Israel. Okay? And then there are progressive dispensationalists. They soften that Israel church distinction I was just talking about. There are other dispensations, but it's not as much of a parenthesis. There's a little bit of an overlap in how they talk and think about those things. And there's also, I mentioned, the traditional dispensationalists and the grace movement dispensationalists. And the grace movement folks, they emphasize that the beginning of the church began with the ministry of Paul, not with the ministry of Jesus. So that would separate them from the other groups. And there are other distinctives. And this is why it would take weeks and weeks and lots of books. I just want to put those out just to get a sense of how complicated, and to be honest, I would almost argue convoluted it can become sometimes. We're not going to talk about all this tonight. So again, there are almost unending variations among dispensationalists, and the number of dispensations vary among the groups. Typically anywhere from 3 dispensations to 8 dispensations. Most dispensationalists hold to a time frame scheme that has 7 dispensations. And these 7 ages that most dispensationalists keep in mind as their grid. So when the dispensationalist is reading the Bible, particularly as they're reading the Old Testament, they're thinking, okay, what dispensation is this talking about? Because God's dealing differently there than he is in this other part. And so the 7 ages in dispensationalist premillennialism would be the age of innocence, the age of conscience, the age of human government, the age of promise, the age of law. And then we get to the final two. We'll spend a little bit more time on these two because they're talking about the present and the future. The age of grace, which is also sometimes called the church age. That's the parenthetical dispensation that they would claim we're in now. And this time generally, again, covers from at least the cross of Christ, maybe the ministry of Christ, possibly Pentecost, somewhere in the first century, or the early first century, up to and through what is referred to as the secret rapture of the church, and then the Great Tribulation. And I'll swing back to that in a sec. Well, no, I'll talk about that now. So the secret rapture, meaning Christ, when he returns in two phases, according to this view. Christ, in his second return, comes part way and then calls up those who are alive on earth and his believers to be swept up off the earth and up into heaven simultaneously, and in a way that the world doesn't notice that Christ came. They just notice that people disappeared. And you've probably seen movies along this line, with the rapture, where all the Christian believers, they all of a sudden they're invisible. All you see are their clothes. Like everything else is gone. That's this view being played out in a book or in a movie or that sort of a thing. And so it's secret because you don't see Jesus. Nobody knows what's going on. Where do the people go? And then the tribulation period begins, this great tribulation period that in the dispensational scheme is 7 years. And then after the rapture and after the 7 years of tribulation, then comes the millennial kingdom. And so Jesus came part way, grabs his people, and then goes back. And then 7 years later, he comes all the way back. And when he comes all the way back, that's not invisible, that's not secret. And then there's 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, the millennium, which is centered, the government for that millennial reign, the kingdom, is centered in Jerusalem, and it ends with God's judgment, and that final judgment comes after a final rebellion. So Christ comes back, rules for 1,000 years, but then there's one last gasp effort by Satan and his demons and the enemies of God to make one last push. It's squashed rather quickly and easily, and then that's it. Everybody goes in the lake of fire who's bad, and everybody else goes on into eternal bliss. So, dispensationalists, they believe that Israel as a nation, because again, ethnic Israel is really important in the dispensational understanding. Israel as a nation state, as a geopolitical entity, and as an ethnic group of people, they will embrace Jesus as the Messiah. And this is going to happen toward the end of the Great Tribulation, toward the end of the 7 years. And that's what primes the pump for Jesus to then return in his second coming. Now, proponents of this view, the dispensational premillennialist view, would include pretty much its founder, John Nelson Darby, its first real spokesperson with a huge amount of influence and voice in theological circles, C.I. Scofield, Harry Ironside, Miles Stanford, R.B. Shiflett, Dwight Moody, Louis Sperry Schaefer, who's the founder of Dallas Theological Seminary. So Dallas Theological Seminary would be a dispensational premillennialist seminary. And Tim LaHaye, who is famous as the author of the Left Behind series, which whispered a moment ago. It's a series of books that were very popular throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. They made a series of movies about them. I think they might have starred Kirk Cameron in the movies. And again, lots of other famous names are in this camp as well.
And we're going to pause there with the famous names in the camp and all that sort of thing. This is the Faith Debate on News Radio 930 WFMD. We're walking through eschatological views. We're talking about, we talked today mostly about postmillennialism. We started getting into dispensationalism. We'll talk more about dispensationalism next week. Also, we'll get to amillennialism and some of the various aspects of being pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and other things like that. So if you've always kind of wanted to have a run-through towards these different kind of views and what all these different names and labels mean, well, then this series of shows is for you. So this is one of 3 shows in a row we're going to do on this topic. So we'll be back next week picking up where we left off this week. If you want to find us online, it's WFMD.com, keyword faith. You can find us on Facebook. You can find me personally, Troy Skinner, on Facebook, on Gab, on MeWe, on Parler, and at householdoffaithinchrist.com. Householdoffaithinchrist.com is a website I have where all sorts of stuff about me and the church that I'm involved with. Anyway, till next time, 167 and a half hours from right now. God bless.
O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder